I've worked with athletes from 28 different sports, and there's one thing I think that is lacking from most of their training programs, and it's a focus on eccentric and isometric contraction. That's what I noticed. They are super strong concentrically, but normally they don't have the eccentric strength or isometric strength to go along with it. And really, I believe that most sports, even though you have to have a lot of concentric strength, it's really the eccentric and isometric that is the key to performance, because eccentric is what makes you absorb force. Isometric allows you to shift from absorption to propulsion. Yeah. And of course, we know that if your eccentric strength ratio is higher, then your chance of injuries are lower. So have you found something similar, or have you found other things that are lacking in most athletes' training programs?
I'd say similar, and we're going to agree on this topic because, as you know,
that's going to be a really short capsule then.
We're done. I agree.
How's your weekend?
So eccentrics and isometrics are super good tools in rehab, as you know. I work with athletes always in their off season. I don't get to work with them, you know, in my mandate. I don't get to work with them in season or when they're preparing. So I get them in the off season when they're in that recovery period. Mm-hmm. So they're coming back from whatever sport they're doing. They're coming back from doing what they consistently do, right? And so first step is recovery. And I find what's lacking is low threshold stuff. So slow, controlled movements. In their sport, they're always, go, go, go. What happens when you're always doing something with the only goal of the end result? Mm-hmm. Never really thinking about what you're doing. And then you come to the gym and you're doing the same thing. Dynamic reps, the goal is get the bar up, right? It's the same strategy. It's always high threshold. It's always dynamic, and they're never doing slow, controlled stuff. So I find that's what they're missing, and you tap into that with eccentrics and isometrics.
And one thing is, I've noticed that the best athletes seldomly are the best movers. They are normally the best compensators.
Yep.
And I think that when you do only like super fast movement, then you naturally compensate, and that's where the best compensators shine. But it's the slow movement that allow you to build that precision, to improve movement pattern.
Exactly.
So the slow eccentric would be good in that regard.
Yeah.
So how do you implement slower training or low threshold work in the training of your athletes?
Personally, I do a lot of mobility and activation stuff. We do a lot of core stuff. We do some primal movement, which I think we'll get to in another capsule. Some, I said some. Yeah. We don't
every
overemphasize,
tool,
right?
Every tool when properly used is useful.
Exactly. So a lot of, I like to use the term contrology. Mm-hmm. Joseph Pilates was big on that. So a lot of I mix a lot of yoga-based stuff. I mix a lot of core stuff, a lot of mind-muscle connection stuff. So again, a lot of isolation.
Mind-muscle connection stuff.
So a lot of isolation movement, a lot of isometrics. We were talking about isometrics, slow and controlled. So you mentioned eccentrics. So the point is it needs to be controlled, and they need to put thought into it versus having them do something dynamically, where again they're going to go all out, dynamic, and they're not gonna think about what they're doing.
Have you ever used, and I'm just taking a guess here because it's something I naturally do when I'm doing isolation work. I don't teach it, but I do it naturally by myself. Is oftentimes when I'm doing like slower controlled stuff, isometrics, I tend to close my eyes to really focus on that mind-muscle connection. So it's something I naturally do. But when the athletes you work with are doing that controlled stuff, what kind of cue do you give them?
I find I have to use a lot of hands-on with especially with our younger athletes, because you can cue them verbally as much as you want. That's their strategy, is to move fast, is to use high threshold, and no matter how much you cue them verbally, the best way I find is to actually physically get my hands on them and slow them down, and then work them through the pattern, and then release them a little bit and see. And then again, oftentimes they right away they start accelerating. So I use a lot of manual stuff.
How do you transition from that low threshold stuff to the higher threshold work?
There I have to make my recommendations to the trainers, right? Because I'm involved in their mobility stuff, and then I I follow them through to the trainers, but I give recommendations as to what each and every one of them will need. So when I screen them at the beginning of the off season, that's also what I do. Here's what he needs to work on. Here's what he needs to work on. So the transition part is a lot of working with the trainers to break down the movements that they're using in the gym. So I'm going to say use more tempo. Let's not work speed right away with this guy. So it'll be more collaborative stuff with the trainers that are working with them.
When you make the recommendation of using slower tempos, are you specifically referring to eccentric, or do you also sometimes have them slow down the concentric?
Sometimes have them slow down the concentric as well.
Is it mostly...
And the transitions.
Yeah, and what would be your logic behind that?
Again, I find that and again, this is with the younger athletes, but I find that sometimes when they accelerate through the concentric, they're losing that pattern, that they're losing that coordination. So they'll be really slow and controlled on the eccentric and everything will look good, but then they'll compensate because they want to go fast on the concentric.
They're using like this initial burst that creates momentum, but once momentum has been created, then the muscle itself stops controlling the load. So
let's take a lunge, for example. So if I have them only slow down the eccentric, they may do exactly what I tell them to do. So the lunge will look really good on the eccentric, but then if I don't tell them to go slowly on the concentric as well, they'll thrust the body forward, let the knee come forward, and they're really trying to generate speed into that concentric contraction, but then they're not doing the pattern that I want them to do anymore. So yes, I slow down both.
From what you're saying, and I actually agree, it's been my experience, is that the problem that most coaches have when they work with athletes is that they want immediate results and they focus too much on high performance stuff without making sure that the athletes first are efficient at utilizing their muscles the proper way.
Yeah.
Both controlling every movement, but also having the muscles do the work.
Yeah.
Anyway, people say, well, they need stretch reflex to be an athlete, of course, but you already are doing stretch reflex stuff 6 months out of the year when you're doing your sport for years, year in, year out. So it's not like it's undertrained.
No, and you don't have to do, the whole time you get them in the gym, you don't have to have them doing specific stuff. You don't have to have them always doing the same energy systems, the same, your specificity is gonna increase towards the end of the off season in preparation
in the beginning,
for the
you should actually train what you have not trained with your sport.
What you've lost,
exactly.
And you should be doing the opposite of what you're consistently doing during your season.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that most coaches focus on specificity way too early and too often, especially with young athletes who don't yet have that foundation of motor control and muscle mass to start with.
Yep.
Very interesting point. So stay tuned for next capsule.